In the shadowy hills of eastern Colorado, long buried beneath generations of silence and official amnesia, lay a truth so grotesque, so staggering, that local authorities quietly smothered it for over a century. Between the years 1852 and 1888, more than 800 pioneers vanished along a desolate 20-mile stretch of the Overland Trail. Not from fever, not from accidents, nor from the wild elements of the frontier. What took them was far darker. A place called Holy Cross Chapel, once hailed as a sanctuary for the sick and the dying, turned out to be the stage for the most methodical mass murder scheme in the blood-stained history of America's westward expansion. At the heart of it all stood the Blackwood family. They didn't kill for desperation. They didn't kill for survival. The Blackwoods killed because they had perfected it, transformed murder into an art. Each life taken was recorded, categorized, archived with a cold precision that turned human suffering into ledger entries. And each new victim was just another name scratched into a book no outsider ever saw. In 1851, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and a voice that held the weight of scripture rode into the Colorado Territory. He called himself Father Nathaniel Blackwood. With him was his wife, a soft-spoken healer known to locals as Sister Margaret, and his younger brother Elijah, whose quiet strength made him indispensable in mending wagons, wrangling livestock, and earning the trust of weary settlers. Together, the three of them built a chapel atop a lonely rise, a crude timber structure with a large, windowless basement and a modest cemetery tucked just behind it. They named it Holy Cross. From the outside, it offered the appearance of salvation, wooden pews facing a simple altar, a wooden cross carved by Nathaniel himself, and promises of rest, worship, and healing. To passing travelers, especially those already crushed by fatigue, sickness, and grief, the chapel seemed like divine mercy made real. What they didn't know was that once you stepped through the doors of Holy Cross, leaving wasn't always an option. In September of 1852, a Missouri family named Morrison was traveling alone after separating from their wagon train. Their youngest child was days from being born, and their patriarch James had sewn the family's savings into his clothing, gold coins, passed down and earned through years of hard labor. When a wheel snapped just 2 miles from the chapel, they thought they were lucky. Blessed even. Until Brother Elijah appeared, as if on cue. "You've been sent here by Providence," Elijah told James, offering to help them reach the chapel. "My sister's birthed more babies than I can count, and my brother, he's a man of the cloth. He'll see you safe." Grateful and unsuspecting, the Morrisons moved into the guest cabin beside the chapel. For 3 days, everything felt like a miracle. Sister Margaret comforted the expectant mother, Elizabeth. Elijah worked tirelessly with James to repair the wagon. Father Nathaniel led the family in prayer, offering scripture and solemn blessings. But on the 4th day, Elizabeth's aging father fell ill. Stomach cramps, nausea, a gray hue to his skin. Sister Margaret called it trail sickness and offered herbal remedies. Within hours, his condition deteriorated. James worried, but Father Nathaniel insisted they trust in God's timing and in Margaret's healing touch. By day 6, 7-year-old Tommy grew sick. Then Mary, age 5. The same symptoms, the same remedies. Only Elizabeth and James remained healthy, until the 12th day, when James too began to fade. And just hours before Elizabeth gave birth, her husband was gone. The baby lived only long enough to be baptized. Elizabeth followed them 3 days later. All told, the entire Morrison family was dead within 3 weeks. Father Nathaniel presided over each burial with solemn dignity. To any outsider, the family had simply succumbed to trail disease. A tragedy, but not unusual. Their belongings, he explained, had been consecrated to the Lord's work, but in truth, the Blackwoods had discovered something that would change their lives forever. Murder, if delivered with patience, piety, and precision, could be astonishingly profitable. and no one was coming to stop them. The Blackwoods understood something few others dared to admit. On the overland trail, death was expected. It came disguised as fever, dysentery, starvation, or simple exhaustion. So when another family vanished in the Colorado wilderness, nobody raised an alarm. There were no telegraphs to send, no towns close enough to notice the silence. The Morrisons simply became another tragic tale whispered by campfires. But to Father Nathaniel, Sister Margaret, and Brother Elijah, their deaths were a revelation. They had stumbled onto a system, a method, and more importantly, a population of victims who were isolated, desperate, and unlikely to be missed. That winter, while the trail traffic slowed to a crawl, the Blackwoods got to work. They meticulously sorted through the Morrisons' belongings, furniture, clothing, heirlooms, and those hidden gold coins. Elijah took charge of transporting valuable items to nearby settlements, where he sold them discreetly to black market dealers. His plain appearance and soft-spoken demeanor made him appear honest, trustworthy. No one questioned him when he claimed he was liquidating goods for a grieving widow or a family that had turned back east. He learned to spread his sales across multiple towns, careful never to draw attention. Margaret, meanwhile, refined her poisons. She began experimenting with doses, blending arsenic into teas, tinctures, even communion wine. She tested delivery methods to make the deaths seem natural, slow and agonizing, mimicking the symptoms of trail illnesses. And when necessary, she played the role of the grieving midwife, mourning beside the very corpses she'd helped create. Father Nathaniel's role was psychological. He mastered the art of spiritual manipulation. When Methodist families stopped at the chapel, he preached of divine healing. Presbyterians heard sermons on predestination and God's unknowable will. Baptists were comforted with promises of heavenly reunion. Whatever the audience needed to hear, he delivered it with conviction. And he listened closely. He learned how to read people's doubts, their fears, their vulnerabilities. It allowed him to nudge them deeper into trust, to weaken their instincts and lull them into accepting help they should have refused. But most chilling of all was the way he catalogued it all. Each death, each family, each stolen item. His ledgers, kept in a locked compartment beneath the chapel floor, recorded lives like entries in a merchant's book. He wrote of departures rather than deaths, acquisitions rather than theft. And when a body was buried, he noted the exact coordinates in the grove behind the chapel, as if filing away merchandise. By spring of 1853, they were ready to begin again. Their next target was the Hoffman family, German immigrants who had saved for years to build a new life in California. Heinrich Hoffman, a skilled clockmaker, traveled with his pregnant wife Greta and 3 young children. Their wagon carried tools, fine textiles, and a significant stash of gold hidden in secret compartments. Their misfortune came when their axle cracked along a muddy ridge near Holy Cross. Right on cue, Brother Elijah appeared, friendly and full of offers to help. The Hoffmans, their English broken and their customs foreign, were easy to isolate. The Blackwoods welcomed them like kin. Margaret offered medicine to ward off trail illnesses, and Greta, desperate to protect her unborn child, eagerly accepted. This time, the poisoning began immediately. Small doses, just enough to cause fatigue and nausea. When the family grew concerned, Father Nathaniel invoked Scripture, citing trials and spiritual purification. "The Lord tests those he loves," he reminded them. The Hoffmans' deaths came slowly over a full month, an experiment in patience for the Blackwoods. But it paid off. They were able to catalog and transport the family's possessions without suspicion. Elijah had already identified buyers for Heinrich's tools and Greta's fine linens. The gold, as always, would be divided and stored among different caches in surrounding towns. 3 families, 16 dead, and not a soul knew. The Blackwoods had become more than killers. They were architects of oblivion, and their next season was just beginning. By the end of 1853, the Blackwoods had perfected their model, an enterprise cloaked in holiness and framed by grief. Every word they spoke, every gesture of compassion, every hymn sung inside Holy Cross Chapel was calculated to draw people closer to death. And with each successful operation, they grew bolder. It was during the spring thaw of 1854 that they encountered the Weatherby family, a clan unlike their previous victims. Charles Weatherby, a former Confederate officer, traveled west with his wife Margaret, their twin daughters Sarah and Susan, both 15, and Margaret's younger brother David, a blacksmith with a full set of tools and a sharp mind. The family's wagon was sturdy, outfitted with concealed compartments hiding gold coins, heirlooms, and valuable documents. Charles, battle-hardened and vigilant, had survived war and loss. He didn't trust easily, and that made him dangerous. Their introduction came the way most did: a cracked wagon wheel, a remote patch of trail near the chapel, and Brother Elijah, conveniently nearby. But Charles wasn't a man prone to gratitude. When Elijah offered help and mentioned the chapel, Charles declined. "We'll manage," he said firmly, glancing at the horizon. "We've handled worse." Father Nathaniel knew a direct approach wouldn't work, so he changed tactics. That evening, as the Weatherbys camped just off the trail, Nathaniel paid them a visit, not with tools or scripture, but with a warning. "There's been sickness in these parts," he said, his voice low and concerned. "Mountain fever. Creeps up slow. You don't see it coming until it's too late. My sister, she's treated half a dozen cases this month alone." The mention of disease struck a nerve, especially with Margaret. She'd read about cholera outbreaks and trail fever, and her daughters had already shown signs of exhaustion. When David developed a mild cough the next morning, their resistance crumbled. They agreed to stay at the chapel just a few nights. Margaret never left. This time, the Blackwoods moved slowly. Margaret was given light doses of arsenic, barely enough to raise suspicion. Father Nathaniel preached to Charles about duty and sacrifice, spinning verses to match the officer's sense of order. Sister Margaret tended to the girls with gentle efficiency, and Elijah bonded with David over tools and repairs. But Charles watched everything. He asked questions, noticed details, and something didn't sit right. He began to suspect. He couldn't explain why, not at first. It was the way Elijah hovered near the wagon, as if cataloging its contents, the strange discoloration in the tea Margaret was drinking, the way Sister Margaret avoided letting anyone see her prepare medicine, and the graves, too many, too fresh. Then David died. Sister Margaret claimed it was complications from the fever. Margaret fell ill next, and Charles's suspicions hardened into certainty. One night, while pretending to search for firewood, he slipped into the chapel basement. What he found changed everything. Behind a loose panel, he discovered a hidden cache of personal belongings, items far too recent, far too valuable to have been abandoned. A child's doll, worn but clearly loved, a pocket watch engraved with unfamiliar initials, a bundle of letters addressed to cities along the coast, never mailed. Then he found the ledger. Names, dates, itemized possessions, coded references to burial sites, and all in Nathaniel's precise handwriting. He didn't have time to read it all. The next morning, Charles confronted his dying wife. She could barely speak, but he told her what he'd seen. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. Margaret died that night, and Charles awoke the next morning with nausea, cramps, and trembling hands. The Blackwoods had acted fast, accelerating his poisoning, and still he tried to warn his daughters, but his words were dismissed as the confused ramblings of a man slipping into death. Sarah and Susan continued to trust the people who were killing them. Charles Weatherby's warnings fell on deaf ears. His daughters, still reeling from the death of their uncle and mother, clung to the only structure left standing around them, faith in the Blackwoods. And the Blackwoods played their part to perfection. Father Nathaniel offered Charles spiritual comfort, his tone grave but sympathetic. "The body weakens, but the soul endures," he said, placing a hand on Charles's shoulder. "Your family will be reunited in glory." What Charles couldn't see, as the poison hollowed him out from within, was the calm calculation behind Nathaniel's eyes. The preacher knew the former soldier had grown too suspicious. His accelerated decline hadn't been an accident. It was a necessity. By the third morning, Charles could barely sit upright. He'd lost his strength, but not his resolve. And in one final act of defiance, he gathered the last of his energy and attempted escape. He collapsed in the yard, foaming at the mouth, and died before he could cross the property line. With Charles gone, Sarah and Susan became easy to manage. Sister Margaret kept them occupied with gentle hymns and herbal teas, easing their grief with poisoned words and poisoned drinks. They cried, they prayed, they mourned. And with every sip of Sister Margaret's concoctions, they unknowingly edged closer to their own graves. The Weatherby case marked a turning point for the Blackwoods. It had been their most complex operation yet. Charles's military training, his guarded nature, and his investigative instincts had forced them to adapt. And in doing so, they learned something vital. Even the most perceptive, disciplined minds could be broken, if not by lies, then by the grief of losing everyone they loved. The twins died within days of each other, their bodies laid to rest in shallow graves marked with wooden crosses. Father Nathaniel said a few solemn words, quoted scripture, and moved on. But not everything had gone according to plan. During Charles's desperate search through the chapel basement, he had disturbed more than one hidden compartment. In his haste, he left a trail. One of the Weatherby's gold coins was later found beneath a floorboard, something that should have been accounted for, logged and hidden. The oversight troubled Elijah. "You're slipping," he muttered to Nathaniel as they inventoried the belongings. "He almost got away. If he'd made it to the trail—" "He didn't," Nathaniel interrupted coldly, "because we controlled the end of his story." Elijah said nothing more, but the exchange revealed a growing tension. The weight of so many deaths, so many lies, was beginning to leave fractures. That summer, a new wave of settlers began arriving earlier than expected. Word had spread about Holy Cross, about the compassionate preacher, the skilled healer, the kind brother who repaired broken wagons without charge. Families now sought out the chapel. The Blackwoods no longer had to find victims. The victims came to them. Among them was the Patterson family from Ohio. Thomas Patterson, a merchant who had sold his business to start fresh out west, was traveling with his wife Emily, their 4 children, and Emily's unmarried sister, Catherine, a sharp-minded woman in her 30s who had worked as a teacher back east. Their wagon wasn't in distress. No one was ill. But when Elijah rode past and praised their oxen, he skillfully redirected the conversation toward medical supplies. "Sister Margaret's got remedies," he said. "Mountain fever's been bad this season. Not all the signs show right away. We lost a whole family last month who didn't get ahead of it." Emily's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. She insisted on stopping at the chapel for a checkup, just to be safe. Thomas was skeptical, but Catherine agreed with her sister. "We'll stay one night," Thomas said. "Then we move on." But one night was all the Blackwoods needed to set their plan in motion, and this time they'd chosen the wrong family. The Pattersons arrived at Holy Cross under clear skies, their wagon creaking slowly up the chapel's winding path. To outsiders, it was a routine stop, just another family pausing for rest and reassurance before continuing west. But for the Blackwoods, it was an opportunity too perfect to ignore. Sister Margaret greeted them with her usual warmth, offering lemon balm tea laced with trace amounts of arsenic and a calming smile that masked the poison. Emily Patterson thanked her sincerely, unaware that her attempt to protect her family had placed them in grave danger. That evening, Father Nathaniel dined with the Pattersons, asking gentle questions about their journey, their hometown, their plans for Oregon. He was careful not to press too hard, but his mind was already at work, calculating what valuables they might carry and which members of the family would succumb first. Brother Elijah, meanwhile, circled the wagon after dark, noting the quality of their tools, the shape of their chest lock, the layout of their supplies. But there was one variable they hadn't anticipated. Catherine. She was quiet at first, observant. Her background as an educator had sharpened her instincts, and she didn't miss the subtle glances exchanged between the Blackwoods. She noticed that Sister Margaret never allowed anyone near the kitchen when preparing medicine, and that Elijah spent too long near their wagon with no clear purpose. Her suspicions were small at first, tiny red flags that could be rationalized away. But the next morning changed everything. Young Timothy, the Pattersons' youngest child, complained of stomach pain. Catherine found it strange. He had been perfectly healthy the day before. Sister Margaret insisted it was the early signs of mountain fever and prepared a stronger dose of her remedy. When Catherine asked what was in it, Margaret's reply was vague. Too vague. Later that day, Catherine caught sight of the supposed medicine, a cloudy mixture with flecks of something white settling at the bottom. It reminded her of something. Her father had been a pharmacist back in Ohio. She'd spent countless hours as a girl watching him work with compounds and powders. The substance in the tea looked alarmingly like ground arsenic. That night, Catherine made a quiet decision. She would no longer drink anything given to her by the Blackwoods, nor would she allow Timothy to. She made a game of it, telling the boy to pretend to drink, then spit the liquid into a cloth when no one was looking. He giggled at first, but she kept her tone serious. "Don't swallow," she whispered, "no matter what." Over the next 2 days, the rest of the family began to deteriorate. Thomas grew pale and weak. The older children, previously full of energy, became feverish and lethargic. Only Catherine and Timothy remained unaffected. Sister Margaret attributed this to the blessed strength of faith, but Catherine knew better. She began searching the chapel at night, careful to avoid the floorboards that creaked. On the 3rd night, she found the basement, hidden beneath a rug and locked with an iron latch. She used one of Thomas's tools to pry it open and descended the stairs in silence. What she discovered nearly made her scream. Boxes filled with personal effects. Letters addressed to cities that no longer had recipients. Jewelry, clothing, toys, each item a silent scream from a family that had vanished. And in the far corner, a leather-bound book. The ledger, names, ages, items taken, causes of death, falsified, burial instructions, everything, every victim, every theft, every lie was recorded in Father Nathaniel's precise, clerical hand. Catherine knew she had to act, but she couldn't do it alone. The rest of the family was too far gone. Only Emily was still lucid, barely clinging to consciousness. So Catherine whispered the truth into her sister's ear. "We're being poisoned," she said, "and if we don't leave now, we'll die here." Emily's eyes widened, the truth breaking through her pain. They had to run. The escape had to be fast, silent, and invisible. Catherine knew they had no margin for error. The Blackwoods weren't merely killers. They were performers, planners, experts in deception. And if they sensed even the faintest suspicion, there would be no second chance. She waited until the 3rd night after uncovering the ledger. By then, Thomas was unconscious. The 2 oldest Patterson children hadn't spoken in nearly a day. Emily was slipping in and out of delirium. Only Timothy was stable, thanks to Catherine's quiet vigilance. He clung to her side, frightened but trusting. Catherine packed a few supplies. Water, food, a small satchel of gold Thomas had hidden under the wagon. She helped Emily from the bed. her sister's frail body barely able to stand. Every step was a struggle, but Catherine pushed forward, whispering encouragement with each motion. The night air was cold. Moonlight cast thin silver lines across the chapel yard. Catherine led them behind the tool shed and toward the wagon. She'd stashed a blanket and some basic provisions there days before, anticipating this very moment. Timothy climbed in without a word, slipping beneath the canvas. Catherine helped Emily in next, then reached for the reins. That's when she heard the footsteps. Slow, methodical, and far too familiar. Father Nathaniel stepped out from the chapel's porch, his silhouette backlit by the lantern inside. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He had been waiting. "Sister Catherine," he said softly, his voice steady and smooth. "Where are you going?" She turned slowly, forcing her breathing to stay calm. "I couldn't sleep," she answered, keeping her tone neutral. "Emily's pain. I thought some fresh air might help." Nathaniel descended the steps, his coat brushing the wood. Strange time for a stroll, especially with the boy already in the wagon. His eyes narrowed. "Why don't we step inside? Sister Margaret has prepared something to ease your rest." Catherine's pulse thundered in her ears. She could see the outline of a weapon under his coat. Maybe a blade, maybe a pistol. Either way, she was outmatched. But she had one advantage. She wasn't alone. From behind the wagon, Emily appeared, staggering but upright. In her shaking hands, she held Thomas's revolver, an antique but functional sidearm he kept hidden in a false panel. Her voice was little more than a whisper. "Step away from my sister." Father Nathaniel froze, not in fear, but in calculation. His eyes flicked to the weapon, then back to Catherine. "You've made a mistake," he said, the warmth gone from his voice. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." "Don't move," Catherine ordered, reaching for a hammer she'd hidden beneath the wagon seat. "Or I swear to God she'll shoot you." He took one more step. Catherine didn't wait. She lunged, striking him in the side of the head with the hammer. He fell, dazed but alive. She didn't stop to see if he'd rise. "Go!" she screamed, scrambling onto the driver's bench. She snapped the reins and the oxen lurched forward, the wagon creaking into motion. Behind them, a door slammed open. Elijah. She glimpsed his figure emerging from the shadows, racing toward the chapel cabin where the rest of the family lay dying. Catherine knew he was going to finish the job. They couldn't stop him. They could only escape. The wagon bounced violently along the uneven trail. Emily collapsed inside, barely conscious. Timothy clutched her arm, too terrified to speak. Catherine drove through the night, through unfamiliar woods, following only instinct and the outline of the stars. 3 days passed before they found help. A military patrol near Fort Garland intercepted the wagon. At first, the soldiers believed Catherine had gone mad, her clothes torn, her face gaunt, her words tangled with desperation. But then they saw Emily. The lesions, the vomiting, the death in her eyes. And they listened. They listened as Catherine told them everything. What they learned would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about the American frontier. The officers at Fort Garland didn't know what to believe. Catherine Patterson's tale sounded impossible, like the rantings of a woman driven mad by loss and hardship. But her voice never cracked. Her eyes never flinched. And the details were too precise to dismiss. She handed them a small cloth bundle, the one she'd used to hide the medicine she and Timothy had secretly refused. Inside it were flecks of the powder she had seen Sister Margaret stir into the tea. She described the symptoms, the sequence of deaths, the items she'd found beneath the chapel. Most importantly, she wasn't alone. Emily Patterson, though barely conscious, bore the physical evidence of poisoning. Her gums were gray, her skin had yellowed. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. The officers had seen trail sickness before, but never like this. And when a medical assistant identified the residue in the cloth as likely arsenic, the story could no longer be ignored. The fort's commander, Captain Ira Wexler, dispatched a team of 10 men to ride with Catherine back toward the chapel. When they arrived, the Blackwoods were gone. Holy Cross sat silent beneath a sky thick with storm clouds. The door creaked open with ease. The pews inside were untouched. The altar stood as before. But behind the pulpit, the trap door to the basement gaped open. Inside, the soldiers found what Catherine had described, and worse. Dozens of chests, crates, and trunks lined the walls, some still packed with clothing, jewelry, tools, and heirlooms. There were letters dated across multiple years, addressed to cities as far as Boston and San Francisco. Letters that had never been sent. But what chilled the men most was the burial ledger. Handwritten, bound in worn leather, the pages filled with names, dates, itemized lists of possessions, causes of death, and locations of graves. It was clinical, soulless, like a merchant's inventory, except the merchandise was human lives. Catherine's description had been accurate in every detail. And so began the largest manhunt in Colorado's short history. Word of the Blackwoods crimes spread quickly, carried by military couriers and frontier newspapers alike. Posters were printed. Rewards were offered. Descriptions of Nathaniel, Margaret, and Elijah Blackwood were sent to every major outpost from Kansas to California. But the trail had gone cold. Some said they'd fled south. Others believed they'd split up. A few frontier towns even reported sightings, but none confirmed. The Blackwoods, it seemed, had vanished like ghosts into the very wilderness they once used to hunt their prey. Meanwhile, Catherine and Timothy were taken to a hospital ward at Fort Garland. Emily died 2 weeks after their arrival. The damage done by the arsenic had been too great. Her body simply stopped fighting. Timothy, though shaken, survived. But the boy who emerged from that nightmare would never be the same. He spoke less, slept poorly, clung to Catherine with quiet desperation. His nightmares, when they came, were filled with firelight, hymns, and the echo of hollow sermons. Catherine testified before a territorial marshal 2 months later. Her account, delivered without embellishment, became the cornerstone of the investigation. She recounted the Weatherbys, the Hoffmans, the Morrison family, all the names she had found in the ledger. She described the poison, the rituals, the psychological manipulation, and when asked how she'd survived, she answered simply, "I stopped trusting kindness." The case sent shockwaves through the frontier. For years, missionaries had been seen as guardians, beacons of faith along a path plagued by hardship. Now, every chapel built off the main trail drew suspicion. Every friendly preacher or healer met with narrowed eyes. The wilderness had always been dangerous, but now, even the people who promised salvation were feared. Back at the fort, Captain Wexler ordered the chapel destroyed. On a cold October morning, soldiers set fire to the Holy Cross. The flames consumed the altar, the pews, and the cursed earth beneath. The smoke curled upward, dark and heavy, like the sins it carried. But the Blackwoods weren't finished. They were merely regrouping. The fire that consumed Holy Cross Chapel was meant to be an ending, but for the Blackwoods, it was merely a transition. They had planned for this moment long before Catherine Patterson ever stepped through their door. They'd always known exposure was a possibility, that one day someone would escape, someone would talk, so they prepared. Within days of their disappearance, they were already wearing new names. Father Nathaniel became Father Benedict Morrison, Sister Margaret, now Sister Mary, and Brother Elijah, who had always been the quiet shadow behind them, took the name Thomas. They crafted a new identity, complete with forged documents and a new story of piety and purpose. This time, they wouldn't operate from a chapel. They would build a mission. Tucked along the Oregon-California border, the newly named Mission of Divine Mercy rose quickly, faster than most buildings in that unforgiving land. It stood near a cluster of wagon routes, where families, often traveling alone, would pass by in search of guidance, rest, or healing. The Blackwoods knew those travelers well. They knew the exhaustion in their eyes, the hunger in their children, the weight of too many miles, and once again they knew exactly what to say. "We offer rest for the weary," Father Benedict told them, his voice heavy with practiced humility. "The Lord calls us to serve." This new mission had improvements. The basement was larger, with hidden compartments lined with lead to mask the scent of decay. Separate rooms for administering treatments, tunnels for escape, a garden in the rear that doubled as a burial site. They had learned from their mistakes, and their operation became even more efficient. But they had also evolved. They were no longer content with waiting for symptoms to develop or pretending to treat fevers. Now, Sister Mary administered poison under the guise of preventative healing, sometimes before travelers even stepped off their wagons. And when someone began to question the medicine, Brother Thomas was ready with distraction, comfort, or removal. It was a system, mechanical, deliberate, perfected. By early 1856, reports began trickling into small settlements across the region. Families who had last been seen near the border were never heard from again. Others were found dead along the trail, too late for any investigation, but always with their wagons stripped of valuables. Still, few made the connection. After all, the Blackwoods had changed everything: their names, their methods, even their approach. They employed local men, lookouts disguised as traders or hunters. These recruits knew nothing of the poison. They were told to report the arrival of wealthy-looking families and to steer them toward the mission. For their silence, they were paid in coin, stolen from the very victims they helped deliver. One such family, the Hendersons, arrived in the spring of 1857. James Henderson was a farmer from Missouri. With his wife, Ruth, and their 4 children, they sought to establish a homestead in California. Their wagon held tools, household goods, and a cache of gold saved over 10 years. To the Blackwoods, they were perfect. Father Benedict greeted them with open arms. Sister Mary offered a restorative tonic laced with a faster-acting compound than she had ever used before. She was experimenting, pushing the limits of her formula. Within hours, the youngest child, Benjamin, was violently ill. Brother Thomas watched closely, marking how quickly the symptoms manifested. The timing, the effectiveness, it all fed back into the operation. They were adjusting their methods now, measuring efficiency over subtlety. The mission was no longer a spiritual trap. It was a slaughterhouse. But this time, someone was watching them. Federal Marshal William Harlan had been tracking the Blackwoods since the ashes of Holy Cross, and when word reached him of a mission operating suspiciously near the border, he didn't hesitate. He gathered a team, including 2 survivors of other frontier crimes, and set out in silence. They camped in the hills near the Mission of Divine Mercy, observing the comings and goings. What they witnessed turned suspicion into certainty. The Blackwoods hadn't stopped. They had simply become better. Marshal William Harlan didn't act immediately. He knew from Catherine Patterson's testimony that the Blackwoods were masters of deception. Rushing in could mean tipping them off, sending them into the wild again to begin anew under different names in some other God-forsaken corner of the West. So he waited. For over a week, he and his team observed the Mission of Divine Mercy from a secluded ridge. They counted wagons, tracked how many people entered and how many failed to leave. They documented patterns, deliveries, odd movements, and most damning of all, they watched as Brother Thomas personally brought milk to the Hendersons' youngest child just before the boy collapsed. That was the final proof Harlan needed. "We move at dawn," he told his men. The raid began just as the morning mist was lifting from the valley. Harlan's team descended on the mission from all sides, rifles drawn, boots pounding across the dirt. There was no time for subtlety now. If they were going to stop the Blackwoods, they had to move fast and hit hard. Father Benedict was still in his room, scribbling in one of his ledgers when the door was kicked open. He didn't resist. He didn't plead. He simply stood and raised his hands, offering a calm, empty smile. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he said. Harlan ignored him. "Where's the boy?" he demanded. "Which one?" Father Benedict asked. Harlan slammed him against the wall. "Don't test me." Meanwhile, agents fanned through the mission. In the basement, they found crates of personal effects, some still tagged with initials. In another room, hidden behind a false wall, they discovered a rudimentary laboratory. Mortar and pestle, jars of powder, glass vials filled with colorless liquid. It was a killer's pantry, stocked for efficiency. Most shocking of all were the burial plans, maps scrawled with symbols and numbers, matching locations marked in the Blackwoods ledgers. Some were behind the mission. Others scattered along trails, riverbanks, even inside what had once been abandoned mine shafts. But time was short. Upstairs, Sister Mary had attempted to flee. She'd slipped out through a root cellar door, only to be caught by a deputy hiding behind the well. When they dragged her back inside, she was shaking, not from fear, but rage. "You don't understand," she hissed. "They were already dying. We gave them peace." Harlan spat in disgust. "You fed them poison." "They would have died of fever, starvation, or worse," she snapped. "We made it painless. We made it holy." Brother Thomas put up the only fight. When two agents cornered him in the stable, he lunged with a butcher's knife. One of the agents fired, striking him in the shoulder. He collapsed, bleeding and cursing, his face contorted with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it either. The Henderson family, miraculously, was still alive. Marshal Harlan found them locked in a back room, pale and weak but breathing. James Henderson, though barely able to speak, told the agents everything. How they'd arrived. The symptoms that began hours after drinking the mission's medicine. The calm voices that kept reassuring them while their bodies failed. His wife Ruth wept as they carried her children out one by one. That rescue changed everything. It wasn't just testimony now, it was survival. Proof. The Blackwoods had been caught mid-kill, surrounded by the tools of their trade. Their masks had slipped, and this time they would not be able to vanish. The mission of divine mercy was sealed off. The survivors taken to a military infirmary, and the Blackwoods, Nathaniel, Margaret, and Elijah, were shackled and loaded into separate wagons under armed guard. As the convoy pulled away from the blood-stained mission, Harlan stood by the gates, staring at the building that had masqueraded as a house of God. He didn't feel victory. He felt dread, because he knew what he'd read in the ledgers. This had only been one of several planned locations. The Blackwoods had been building something far bigger. Marshal Harlan stared at the ledger long after the prisoners had been carted away. Its pages were stained with time, inked in meticulous lines of script that reduced lives to numbers. Beside each name, a method. Beside each date, an outcome. And beside some entries, a symbol he hadn't recognized. Not at first, but the deeper he read, the clearer it became. The mission of divine mercy hadn't been a standalone operation. It was a prototype, one node in a broader network the Blackwoods had planned. Locations in Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, all of them mapped out in coded drawings and cryptic references. Some marked ready, others noted as in development, and always beneath those markings, lists of names. Locals, potential recruits. They weren't just murderers, they were builders. Each site had been chosen with strategy in mind. Routes with heavy wagon traffic, areas lacking formal law enforcement. Places where isolation was common and help rare. The perfect environment for false missionaries to operate without question under the protective veil of religion. Harlan turned to one of the final entries, scribbled in a more hurried, uneven hand. It described a plan for mass execution, several families at once. Simpler, more efficient, less time for suspicion to grow, less chance for escape. There were references to new poisons, more potent, less detectable, and beneath it all, a single chilling line scrawled in red. When they come willingly, the work becomes divine. The Blackwoods had believed their mission wasn't just profitable. They believed it was righteous. The trial began in the fall of 1857 under armed guard in a fortified courthouse in Sacramento. The authorities had no choice. The crimes were too extensive, the public outrage too volatile. Journalists from as far as New York and New Orleans flocked to the proceedings, eager to report on the sensational case of the murderous missionaries. The courtroom was packed every day. Survivors like James Henderson testified first, then doctors, forensic experts, military investigators. But it was Catherine Patterson's testimony, delivered after a full year in seclusion, that seared itself into the national memory. She recounted every detail of the Holy Cross Chapel, the smiling preacher, the poisoned tea, the smell of the basement where her family's future had been sorted like inventory. And when asked why she'd survived when so many others hadn't, she answered without hesitation, "Because I stopped believing that kindness was safe." The defense mounted a weak strategy, claiming the deaths had been due to trail illnesses. They argued the Blackwoods had only administered natural remedies and that the stolen goods had been offered in gratitude. But the prosecution produced the ledgers, the poison jars, the burial maps, and the witnesses. No jury needed convincing. Father Nathaniel Blackwood was sentenced to death by hanging. Sister Margaret received life in prison for her role in the poisonings, marking one of the rare cases in American history where a woman was convicted for mass murder. Brother Elijah was found guilty as an accessory and sentenced to 20 years. When asked if he had anything to say, Father Nathaniel smiled at the courtroom. "They came to us broken," he said. "We gave them peace." No one spoke as he was led away, but what lingered wasn't just the horror of their crimes. It was the scale, the planning, the sense that, had they not been stopped, the Blackwoods might have established an entire system across the American West, a hidden network of death that wore the mask of salvation. After the sentencing, Marshal Harlan burned the remaining maps. Not out of vengeance, but necessity. He knew others might try to finish what the Blackwoods started, and he understood one terrifying truth. Evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it stands in the light, holding a Bible, whispering prayers, waiting. News of the Blackwoods' capture and sentencing spread across the country like wildfire. Newspapers labeled them the Mission Butchers, the Preacher of Poison, and the Holy Cross Killers. But even as the nation devoured every sordid detail, something more insidious began to take root. Copycats. Within a year of the trial's conclusion, authorities in Utah discovered a small encampment near the Green River. It posed as a traveling ministry led by a soft-spoken man claiming to be a former seminary teacher. Families who stopped there vanished. Their wagons were found burned. Belongings gone. Graves hastily dug near the waterline. Inside the minister's tent, buried under layers of scripture, they found a tattered notebook filled with death entries eerily similar to the Blackwoods' original ledger. The handwriting was different, the methods less refined, but the influence was unmistakable. Marshal Harlan had feared this very thing, that the Blackwoods' sick theology would not die with them, but multiply. He had burned the original maps, destroyed the known ledgers, and pushed for sealed records. But something had already escaped into the collective psyche, the myth of the missionary killer, the allure of power under the cloak of righteousness. In her quiet home near Denver, Catherine Patterson followed the news with increasing dread. She hadn't spoken publicly since the trial, not to reporters, not even to survivors' groups. But in private, she kept a journal. Not of what had happened, but of what she feared might still come. Her nightmares hadn't faded. She still woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hearing Elijah's footsteps, smelling Sister Margaret's bitter tea. She heard Father Nathaniel's sermons behind her eyes, preaching salvation while death sat in the pews. And worst of all, she sometimes dreamed of Timothy, still a child, standing outside the chapel, smiling at the door that never should have opened. Timothy had survived, yes, but the boy Catherine had once known was long gone. He rarely spoke now. He flinched at church bells, refused to attend Sunday school, and could not bear the sight of white collars or crucifixes. He had learned to read, to write, to ride a horse, but he had never laughed the same way again. Catherine didn't try to force him back to normal. She knew better. Instead, she taught him vigilance, how to observe, how to question, how to listen beneath the words people spoke. Because she knew the truth few wanted to admit. Monsters weren't just born in the dark. Sometimes they were shaped by scripture and polished by ritual. Sometimes the most dangerous hands were the ones that offered help. Meanwhile, Sister Margaret Blackwood sat in a cell at Yuma Territorial Prison. The desert sun scorched the walls, but she never complained. She spent her days sewing quilts, praying aloud, and writing long letters to no one. Some of them were intercepted and confiscated, filled with cryptic references to a greater work and a coming refinement by fire. Prison officials dismissed them as the ramblings of a madwoman. They weren't. Back in Sacramento, a young man working as a clerk for the courthouse stumbled upon a sealed evidence box from the trial. Inside, he found copies of the Blackwoods' early sermons, transcripts copied by hand. What disturbed him most wasn't the content. It was how persuasive they were. He wasn't the first to feel it. He wouldn't be the last. The mythology around the Blackwoods began to evolve. Folk songs cropped up in isolated mining camps. Ghost stories spread among children in orphanages. Preachers used their tale as a warning of false prophets. But in corners of the country, untouched by law or logic, others saw the Blackwoods as something more than killers. They saw them as visionaries. Blueprints. Catherine saw it too. And one morning she wrote a single line in her journal, a sentence she would return to again and again. They stopped one fire, but the embers are still burning. Catherine Patterson had survived the Blackwoods, testified against them, and lived to see them fall, but she never allowed herself to believe it was truly over. And as she watched whispers of their twisted gospel resurface across the frontier, her fears turned to certainty. A year after writing that haunting line in her journal, Catherine was visited by Marshal Harlan. He looked older, thinner. His once jet-black hair was graying at the temples, and the light in his eyes had dimmed. He didn't need to say why he'd come. She already knew. "They found another one," he said softly. "In Utah this time. A couple. Preaching to travelers. Medicine. Mercy. All of it." Catherine closed her journal. "Were they connected to the Blackwoods?" Harlan nodded slowly. "Used the same scriptures. Same phrasing. Claimed to be part of something called the Refined Path. We found a pamphlet in their wagon. The language, it was nearly identical to Father Nathaniel's early sermons." Catherine felt the old coldness return, that hollow sensation in her chest like she was falling through herself. She thought of Sister Margaret sitting in her cell, writing her letters into the void. Only now she wasn't writing to no one. She was writing to the next generation. What happened to them? "They're dead," Harlan answered. "Took their own lives before we could question them." Catherine didn't cry. She hadn't in years. Instead, she stood, walked to the mantel above the fireplace, and picked up a box wrapped in oilskin. Inside were copies of everything she had saved. Photographs, documents, maps, journal entries, even one of the original ledgers she had smuggled from the Holy Cross basement. "I kept it all," she said, "in case this day came." Marshal Harlan accepted the box with silent gratitude. He looked down at her hands, saw the tremor in her fingers, and knew that, even now, the ghosts of the past still lingered. And they weren't done haunting her. By the time Harlan left Denver, his mind was already racing. He didn't return to Sacramento. He went straight to Yuma. The prison hadn't changed much. Dusty, brutal, forgotten by most of the country. But Sister Margaret had changed. Her hair was now snow white, her body withered by heat and time. Yet when she saw Harlan, she smiled with eerie calm, as if she had expected this reunion. "Marshal," she said softly, "come to confess?" "No," he replied, taking a seat. "I came to ask why it's still happening, why your sickness is spreading again." Her smile didn't waver. "It was never mine," she whispered. "It was his. We were just the vessels. You cut off one limb. The body still moves." "You're not a prophet," he growled. "You're a murderer." "And yet," she said, leaning forward, "they still come?" She told him about the letters. Not just those she had written, but those she had received. Smuggled in through Bibles, tucked behind bindings, written in invisible ink. Messages from followers she'd never met. Some used fake names, others no names at all. All of them echoing the same belief, that the work of the Blackwoods had only just begun. "They believe in us now," she said. "Even more than we did." Harlan stood without another word, but as he left her cell, a guard handed him a note. Found beneath Sister Margaret's mattress, it was written in careful, practiced cursive. One line only. "The refined path cannot be unwalked." That winter, Catherine received a letter, not from the government, not from Harlan, but from a young woman claiming to be the daughter of one of the mission's earliest victims. She had grown up hearing whispers of the chapel, the poison, the preacher. Now she wanted to know the truth. Catherine stared at the letter for a long time. Then she lit a match and burned it to ash. She couldn't protect them all, but she could keep the fire from spreading. For now. Spring brought no peace, though the snow melted and wildflowers returned to the plains outside Denver. Catherine Patterson felt no thaw inside herself. The letter she had burned haunted her more than she cared to admit. It hadn't been threatening. It hadn't promised anything sinister. But it had stirred something dormant, an echo of the fear she thought she'd buried. The woman who wrote it had signed only her first name, Abigail. She claimed to be the daughter of Henry Barnes, a man whose name Catherine had seen scrawled in one of the earliest pages of the Holy Cross ledger. According to Abigail, her father had left home in Illinois to join a church group traveling west. He was never seen again. The authorities had chalked it up to weather or bandits, but her mother had always whispered another word. Blackwood. Catherine had hoped those whispers had died out, but now a new generation was listening, and what terrified her most wasn't that people were still asking questions. It was that some might want answers for the wrong reasons. She began noticing strangers in town. Not many, but enough. A man with an unusual silver brooch in the shape of a cross. A woman who asked too many questions at the library, particularly about frontier religions and unsolved disappearances. A boy who sat in the back of church and never blinked through the sermon. One afternoon, Catherine entered her barn and found a leather-bound book tucked behind the feed sacks. It wasn't hers. It was a replica of the original Blackwood ledger. Blank pages. But on the first one, written in the same sharp, looping script she had seen years ago, were 3 words. "You were chosen." She didn't tell the sheriff, didn't alert the townspeople. She knew better. Some truths spread like infection when spoken aloud. Instead, she sealed her home tighter, carried a small revolver under her coat, and began rewriting her entire journal by hand, this time in cipher. Meanwhile, far from Denver, in a shadowed corner of New Mexico territory, a new preacher took root. He was young, charismatic, His followers called him Brother Gideon. He spoke softly, quoted scripture with an intensity that felt personal. His sermons weren't fire and brimstone. They were calm, almost mournful. He spoke of cleansing pain, of rising from despair through submission, and most chilling of all, he never asked for offerings of gold, only obedience. His congregation grew slowly but deliberately. Travelers spoke of a quiet camp nestled near the foothills, where wounded souls were taken in, where sick children were healed or disappeared. Local officials dismissed it as another revivalist group, but in certain towns, families whispered of wagons that never returned, of goods sold that should have been buried, of men who smiled too long when asked about faith. Marshal Harlan, now retired, spent his days in Santa Fe, but his mail was never quiet. A letter arrived bearing no return address. Inside was a single photograph. A man, maybe 30, dressed in black, standing in front of a crude wooden cross. Written on the back, "We remember the path." Harlan's hands shook as he poured himself a drink. His badge still hung near the door, though he hadn't worn it in years. He stared at it now, knowing what it meant. This wasn't resurrection. It was replication. And across the plains, in a dusty tent beneath the desert stars, Brother Gideon sat at a table with 5 acolytes. They wore white. Their hands were clean, their eyes wide. He placed a ledger before them, not old, not original, but ready. "Every age must refine its tools," he said softly. "Ours begins now." Brother Gideon's mission was quiet but methodical. He didn't raise churches. He didn't seek out crowds. Instead, he cultivated disciples one by one, always the desperate, always the overlooked. He offered them not redemption, but clarity. And clarity was a powerful drug. The foothills near the San Juan River became sacred ground, a place of gathering, a place of preparation. Campsites appeared where no settlements had been. Small shrines constructed from bones and bleached wood lined the riverbanks. To outsiders, it all looked like harmless frontier religion. But to those inside the circle, it was scripture brought to life. They called themselves the Second Path, and every one of them knew the name Blackwood. In Denver, Catherine Patterson's instincts sharpened to the point of paranoia. Each knock at her door brought a new ripple of fear. Her ciphered journal was now stored in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. She slept lightly, dreamed often, and each dream ended the same way, standing in a church with no roof, surrounded by voices calling her name, but none of them alive. Timothy had grown into a man, but his silence had never lifted. He worked as a blacksmith, kept mostly to himself, and never left town without a pistol. His presence was steady but haunted, like a shadow cast at noon. And still, he never spoke of the mission, not even to her, until the night of the fire. It began at the edge of town, a small boarding house where 2 strangers had checked in under false names. By dawn, the structure was gone, burned to ash. No bodies were found, but townspeople reported seeing someone slip into Catherine's yard just hours before. When she found the scorched Blackwood emblem carved into her fence post, she knew the message. They were watching. Timothy said only 5 words that night. "We have to go now." Catherine didn't argue. She had prepared for this day. A second identity. A route out of Colorado. A friend in Missouri with a cabin near the woods. They left before sunrise, taking only what could fit in a single wagon. As the town faded behind them, Catherine glanced once more at the home she had tried to make safe. It was no longer hers. Days later, Marshal Harlan stood alone in his study, holding the photograph of Brother Gideon. He traced the man's features with his thumb, trying to spot some echo of the Blackwoods. There was no direct resemblance, but the eyes, they carried the same stillness. That chilling calm that only true believers possessed. He took out Catherine's old journal, the one she had entrusted to him years earlier, and flipped to a page near the middle. "It never starts with the killing. she had written. "It starts with the welcoming." And so Harlan rode again. Old, slower, his hand not as steady, but his mind as sharp as ever. He traveled south, following rumors. Stories of a healer who refused payment, of children baptized in dried creek beds, of travelers who came for rest but left without memory of their stay. He reached the outskirts of the San Juan camp by dusk. He didn't announce himself. He didn't carry a badge. But as he crept through the trees, he heard the voice. Calm, rhythmic, seductive. Brother Gideon stood before his followers, holding a new ledger. "In every age," he said, "the path reveals itself anew. Not through miracles, through obedience, through clarity, and above all, through sacrifice." The crowd nodded, and then, as if sensing the presence of an intruder, Brother Gideon lifted his eyes. He looked straight into the trees, straight at Harlan, and smiled. Harlan didn't flinch when Brother Gideon looked his way. The gaze that met his wasn't one of shock or fear. It was recognition, not of Harlan himself, but of what he represented. Resistance, memory, a tether to the truth the second path had tried so hard to bury beneath scripture and ash. The old marshal backed away from the clearing, silent as dust. He didn't need more proof. He had seen enough in that smile. The same calm certainty Nathaniel Blackwood had worn moments before the gallows dropped. The same conviction Sister Margaret carried in her cell, even as her bones decayed behind stone. Back in Santa Fe, Harlan penned one final report. He detailed the location, the rituals, the new faces behind the old doctrine. He named Brother Gideon. He named the group. And in a final paragraph, written with shaking hands, he closed with a warning. "This is not a revival, it is a continuation." Then he disappeared. Some claimed he died in the desert. Others believed he returned to Sacramento to live out his days in quiet anonymity. A few whispered he was killed by the path before he could speak further. But no grave was ever found. No letters, no closure. Catherine never heard from him again. By then, she and Timothy had taken new names and vanished into the folds of rural Missouri. A cabin near the edge of dense woods became their refuge. No neighbors, no church bells, no strangers offering help. Just silence, just distance. But even silence has a sound. One evening, years later, a young man arrived at the cabin door. Dust on his coat, eyes too old for his age. He carried no weapon, no threats, only a question. "Did you know them?" Catherine stood still in the doorway. "Who?" "The Blackwoods." She didn't answer. The man held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if that had been an answer in itself. He turned to leave. But before he vanished down the trail, he left something behind. A small cloth bundle, the same kind used to carry medicine long ago. Inside was a copy of the new ledger. The handwriting wasn't Brother Gideon's. It wasn't Sister Margaret's. It was worse. It was precise, clean, unfeeling. The final page was signed, Third Path. Catherine didn't burn it. Not this time. She hid it, and with Timothy's help, she began transcribing every page into her cipher. Every name, every planned movement, every new gathering site. They no longer had allies, no marshals, no courts, but they had time, and they had memory. If they couldn't stop the fire, they could at least trace its smoke. Elsewhere, Brother Gideon's camp dissolved overnight. No evidence, no footprints, just ashes and a single wooden post where the altar had once stood. Etched into the surface were 3 intersecting lines, the emblem of the third path. A new evolution, a new generation, more refined, more patient, and more dangerous. Whispers spread in mining towns again. Families vanished along lesser-known trails. Some said they were taken by bandits, others said plague. But those who remembered knew better. They remembered the chapel. They remembered the tea, They remembered the hymn that started it all. And deep in the hills, where light rarely reached and silence hung like fog, a new preacher lit a candle in the dark. He opened a fresh ledger, dipped his quill into ink, and wrote the first name of the next generation's offering. Not with hate, not with joy, but with purpose. And far away, in the stillness of the Missouri woods, Catherine opened her ciphered book and whispered to the trees, "They are not finished, but neither are we."